From Yahoo Finance, this is Electionomics. I'm Rick Newman.
And I'm Alexis Christoforous. So glad you could be with us this week for Electionomics. So with less than 3 months to go before we cast our ballots for president, the NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll finds former Vice President Joe Biden leading President Donald Trump by 11% among registered voters nationally. Joining us now to discuss the results of that poll is Lee Miringoff, director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion. Lee, always good to have you on the podcast. I guess we should just note up top, this poll was taken before Biden named Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate. We're going to talk about that a little later on. But mail-in balloting has been such a big topic, really at the forefront the past week or so. I'm curious what this poll found in terms of people's comfort level with going in person to vote come November 3rd, if that's available in their district. What did you find?
Well, I mean, I think, in the era of, COVID-19, certainly there's, some added concern. This has been a trend that's been growing anyway in terms of the in-person versus the mail-in or absentee. What we see is a huge difference between the Biden anticipated voters, who are much less likely to vote in person and more likely to go through the mail route, and the Trump voters, who are telling us overwhelmingly that they do plan to vote in person and are less likely to do the mail route. So what's happening here is why the Democrats are so, up in arms over this, is because a lot of their voters are more likely to vote in the early voting period as opposed to election day itself. I might add on this, this is exaggerated phenomena this time, but Barack Obama in both of his elections technically lost on election day to McCain and Romney. It was the early vote that created the margin to sustain his ultimate victories. So Democrats have been voting early, and Republicans more likely to actually vote on election day itself. Although one doesn't know this year because all rules are broken this year, and given the concerns Democrats have over suppression and stuff like that, maybe they'll vote on election day more. Who knows?
Lee, can you go a level deeper on that?
Sure.
Why are Republicans more likely to want to vote in person, and why are Democrats more likely to want to mail in a vote? Is it because Democrats plan ahead better, or Democrats are homebodies? I mean, what is going on that explains that partisan difference?
I think it has to do a lot with mobility. And so if you're, in college, away at college, if you're, not likely to think you're going to be in the area, you sort of take care of your ballot early. There's an age difference. Older folks who tend to be more Republican, they're the ones who tend to vote more in person. So I don't think it has to do with a planning sequence as much as it has to do with just the mobility factor, and also both sides have done efforts to get people to vote early because they obviously would like to have their votes in the hopper before election day and not depend on it. So there's that part, and Democrats have been focusing more on that. Republicans do as well, but not to the extent that the Democrats have. Also, there are states that, as you know, do only mail balloting. So like Utah and Washington, Oregon, and I believe Colorado have been doing this 100% for a while in terms of people, mailing it in advance. It's an interesting process. It wreaks havoc for the folks who do the exit polls because they don't have as many people, and it's not necessarily a representative group who are actually exiting from the voting booth. So they have to do pre-election phone calls and do the exit polls to kind of get the right mix. So it's an added conundrum for them.
So President Trump obviously opposed to mail voting for whatever reason, and he seems to think that mail voting gives Democrats an advantage over Republicans. I mean, he has as much as said that. So he also claims there's a lot of fraud, and there's no evidence. So put that issue, the fraud aside, is it? Can you make the case that mail-in voting actually benefits Democrats over Republicans?
Well, it's that Democrats do vote. I mean, just to look at our last poll that was mentioned at the start, Democrats, the Biden people are 62-36 to mail it in. So almost not 2-1, but a healthy difference. The Trump backers, 72% say they're planning on voting in person. So if you are a strategist,
That's a large difference.
yeah, oh, it's huge, and that's why you're seeing the president, full throttle on, getting this, trying to, do something that, puts a roadblock in front of the mail, and the Democrats are looking for court cases and coming back to Congress to try to stop any changes. So this is not a battle without huge consequences. Now, the battle itself may change people's behavior. And Democrats are maybe saying, gee, maybe I should go, wait till election day. But then you get to the issue of, the number of voting booths. And one of the things that's really interesting is I saw the Los Angeles, LeBron James is organized to have voting at stadiums on election day to try to entice people. And not other baseball and basketball and football arenas are considering opening those up. So gosh, there's nothing occurring in 2020 that resembles anything we've seen before.
Lee, you've been doing this for a long time. There's been some talk on Wall Street that perhaps we're going to have a little post-election chaos. I mean, the market's already volatile, and some investors are betting on that volatility because we may have a contested election. What are the odds of that actually happening? I don't know if you asked in your poll at all, but just what are your thoughts on?
I mean, I think, unless someone wins handily, like 10%, the likelihood is that because of the extensive mail ballot and the delay, slowness in counting, just the physical, effort it goes into, counting the actual number of mailed-in ballots, there's a strong likelihood that, in fact, we do get a sort of a revision of what happened in 2000, which had to do with just Florida. We might have, a half a dozen very contested states where we don't know who's won. People will be able to analyze, so-and-so carried Florida, and maybe that makes a difference but we won't really know. And I think that that's going to be a very unsettled time for the American populace and the stock market, quite frankly, where you have, concerns over not even arguments of rigged and hoaxes and frauds and all those things, but just the mere fact that we could get well into November before we have a sense of who's actually won the presidential election. So, I think it's without a surprise if we do have a delay. It would be a surprise right now if on November 3rd we do have a winner projected. But as I say, everything in 2020 is coming brand new for our democracy, and the economy is going to be in abeyance in terms of, who ends up in the policies the country's now going to go in. We're not going to know probably in the first week of November.
Am I the only one who feels dizzy and nauseated?
Yeah, we're all exhausted. We're not as bad off as you journalists are, because you guys, have just been, having to cover daily cataclysmic events.
Chaos is good for business, I guess, in a way. For us anyway. Lee, you mentioned that everything is different this time. I want to ask about the conventions. We're in the midst of the conventions. And what's typical is each candidate gets a little bit of a bump in the polls, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5%. But obviously, these conventions are different. Do you think the conventions will make any difference at all? Or is this just good? Are we just going to go right through this with most people not noticing?
Well, I would go with the latter. I think the conventions are being broadcast, such as they are virtually, to a very narrow audience. I mean, Democrats are going to be watching the Democrat convention, Republicans watching the Republican convention, and then you have this group in the middle who both sides are trying to still persuade, and it's not a very large group. And that's why you don't get, in an era of polarization, hyper-polarization this time, you don't get huge bounces because you don't have that many persuadable voters out there. We haven't had a big post-convention bounce really since 2000. The big one was 1992 with Bill Clinton. And there were circumstances with Ross Perot and other things that created that. But you get a bounce when you have a lot of undecided voters, and that you also, because the challenging party, in this case the Democrats, goes first, you always get the sort of the introduction to the American people with the first convention, the challenging convention, and that's packaged in a way to try to attract these persuadable voters. And then the incumbent sort of takes it all back, or a lot of it back, the following week or whenever it is. But that's sort of something that occurred, that's so last century in some ways. And right now, the expectation, I saw somebody said Biden may get 8 to 10 points. Well, that's very unlikely because there's barely that many on the table to be gotten at this point.
What is your best estimate of what the percentage of undecided voters is? 5%?
Well, the persuadables, we look at more of the persuadables because there are people who say right now that they're supporting a candidate, but that they might vote differently by election day. So we take those and put them in the undecided, and it comes to around 10%. So you just don't have, you're not going to get a bounce of 16 points that Bill Clinton had in 1992, unless the convention is so overwhelming that you attract people who are going and say, I'm pretty supportive of Donald Trump, and I'm not undecided, and I'm not saying I'm going to vote differently. I'm either a strong supporter or a fairly strong supporter. And so you just don't have a lot on the table.
Are you getting an indication of where those undecided voters are leaning right now?
Well, it's interesting. The undecided voters are, sort of like said by some pundits, and I don't like the term, but they're called the haters, and because they dislike both candidates. It's sort of an odd part of the art slice of the electorate. In 2016, of course, the folks who disliked Hillary Clinton and disliked Donald Trump swung at the end for Donald Trump. Right now, we're seeing the opposite. And it has to do with the fact that Donald Trump is now the incumbent president. So we're seeing more of these so-called haters or people who dislike both of them going in double digits more at this point to Joe Biden. So if there is a fence sitter who is sort of doing the old hold your nose and vote kind of thing, it's a voter who's at this point leaning more towards Joe Biden. But that's still, on the one hand, the election, it's like 80 days away. And on the other hand, people start voting in a couple of weeks in some of these early voting states.
Lee, I want to ask you about Biden's lead. So about, I think, 11 points in your poll.
Sure.
The aggregate that I just saw is 7.7 points. And a lot of people say they expect the race to tighten.
Sure.
As we get closer to election day, kind of because that's just what normally happens. Is that the case? Does the race just happen to tighten in typical fashion, or what do you? What do you think is likely to happen?
Yeah, that's a good crystal ball question, which unfortunately I left in my office at Marist College. If I'd known you were going to ask, I would have brought the Christmas ball, the ball with me, crystal ball with me for this remote interview. But what you do have is
crystal ball on the Google Hangout, maybe.
There you go. I could do it that way. So we have a likelihood that things do get tighter, but I don't think that's a guarantee. And I think it has to do with really what issues are on people's minds. Here's the best scenario for a tighter race. There's a sense, let's say, that a vaccine is just around the corner, and people are increasingly saying, well, the next issue is how do we restart this economy? And then they say, well, we had a pretty decent economy going before we got into this coronavirus. And that might create the scenario that there is a tightening, because that would play more Donald Trump's way. People who think the economy is the most pronounced issue are at best even between the two and more likely to tip in the President Trump's way. So that's the scenario for him. If, on the other hand, people are still concerned about race relations and especially the coronavirus, if that's still, front and center in people's minds, those are people who overwhelmingly support Joe Biden. If that's the issue like we have today, barring any other kinds of, shenanigans one way or the other, there's a good likelihood that that would play Biden's way. So I don't think there's an automatic here. I know in the past things have gotten closer. It's usually because, well, I shouldn't say it's usually because of a challenger catching up, but very often the dynamics are less so about the debates and even less so about the conventions, which we've been talking about. There's no sort of big moment. I guess there's still October surprises, but the way things are going, I mean, we have a surprise almost daily. So I think people are kind of like conditioned even to that.
We have 3 debates coming up, right? Is it going to be 3 debates between Trump and Biden, or is one of the?
Yes.
Do we know if those are going to be virtual, guys, yet, or the?
Well, we don't know. We don't know who the moderators are either. Although the White House put out a list of acceptable moderators. So the first one is September 29th, and that's for the presidential debate. And then there's 2 more presidential, and the last one I believe is October 22nd. I could be wrong on that date, but it's late in October. And in between is the vice presidential debate, which will be very well watched, but isn't usually a mover of voters. I mean, the classic was the Lloyd Benson Dan Quayle debate, where he clobbered Benson with, I knew John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was a friend of mine, and you know John F. Kennedy. Well, that was like a knockout punch, except it didn't move any voters. And so, I mean, the vice presidential debate is more for theater.
Do you think the debate is going to be a little fiery now that we've got Kamala Harris in the race? And have you polled anybody about, Biden's pick for VP yet?
Well, I've seen some polls. Our field poll dates were right at the end of when he picked her. Generally, the first blush has been positive towards her. I think it was an odd pick in that it's been seen as both historic and safe, which I think is almost like a contradiction in terms. So you did something really historic, but you didn't take a risk doing it. So yeah, I mean, I think right now that they think that she will prosecute the case against Donald Trump effectively. And, this is all about expectations. And so the expectations will be that her debate will be, very strong against Vice President Pence. But then again, Pence isn't an amateur at these things. This isn't his first rodeo either. So that can affect that. I think the debates are going to be reinforcing rather than shifting in public opinion. We saw, Barack Obama against Mitt Romney have a terrible first debate, and everybody was saying, wow, that's going to shake up the race. And it didn't. It meant the Romney people got, wow, we really did it. And the Obama people kind of put their heads down and said, yeah, who becomes back in the next one? But people didn't then start switching around. And last time, I mean, the conventional wisdom that Hillary Clinton did very well in the debates. And obviously, there has not been a President Clinton since Bill Clinton.
Lee, President Trump has been pushing this one line of attack against Biden, that he's senile and cognitively challenged.
Sure.
Now, Trump voters might believe that, but they're not the ones he needs to persuade. Do you find any evidence that people believe that?
So right now, the negatives on Joe Biden are, he's upside down. He's -7 in terms of his unfavorable versus favorable. The same thing for President Trump is -25. So when it comes to the comparison, in terms of their negatives, in terms of their character and likability, it really plays much stronger to Biden's advantage. It's sort of a little like a Hail Mary pass for the White House because, Donald Trump obviously isn't the most articulate of presidents and tends to flub words too. So they're sort of hoping that in the debate or maybe at the convention or some other interview that Biden kind of like goes off on a tangent, not unlike what Ronald Reagan did in 1984 in the first debate where he told that famous story at the end. And it never really ended. And so he had to come back at the next debate and kind of make a great one-liner to pull it back because people were really getting worried in that Reagan camp about, his capabilities at that point. So I don't think, short of any surprising, moments, I mean, look, last week we saw Joe Biden taking a bicycle ride, and I mean, it sort of looked like a hardy thing to do for someone who is 78 and supposedly not with all his faculties.
Biden, I hope this comes up at one of the debates. Biden has challenged Trump to a push-up contest, and I think the moderator should say, could each of you please do 10 or 15 push-ups?
Yeah, I think. Well, I suspect both would be huffing and puffing, but then again, so would I. So I'm not gonna get in the middle of that one. Maybe the moderator can join them. I'm trying to remember. Oh yes, I remember Stephen Colbert did a push-up competition. Was that with Chris Cuomo? I think it was.
Yeah,
on air, and
Chris is a lot.
huffing and puffing.
So is Colbert.
Yeah, they were huffing and puffing at the end. So look, I think there's going to be a lot of showmanship in this race. Donald Trump obviously, brings that to any daily event. Joe Biden is not particularly shy, so we're going to expect a lot of fisticuffs at those debates. But again, the question is, do they reinforce or do they persuade? And my expectation is it's a little early to handicap the debates, but I think this is going to be more about which issues are on people's minds rather than the performance of the candidates, barring anything strange occurring.
Yeah, the issue, I mean, in this latest poll, who do people believe is better suited to help the economy? Because that's always a big issue. It's a big issue again this year. We're in this pandemic, so hard to call it. But did they actually, are they pretty evenly divided on who they think is better?
In our numbers, they're evenly divided, a slight advantage to President Trump, but he's doing much better in terms of the economy than he is in terms of race relations and the coronavirus. In the latest NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, the gap was about 10 points in favor of Donald Trump. We were about 2-point difference. So they actually had it more. And this has been something that clearly the White House knows, and to their lack of planning, their desire to open up the economy or to reopen it up, perhaps early, created some real concerns on the part of voters because they wanted to get back to the economy. They would be better off getting back to the economy had they kept things tied down a little longer, because we would have been in better shape right now with the coronavirus. It's very hard to get people to focus on economic rejuvenation when it's 1,000 a day in terms of the casualties. That becomes very, very hard unless you're getting a little numb to that, which is possible too. But it seems that the best thing for the president at this point is, as I said earlier, is the notion that there's a vaccine here or there's one just around the corner, so that the agenda for the second term is not going to be about the coronavirus as much as it's going to be about restarting and reopening and regenerating the economy. And if that's the case, that's the best thing Donald Trump has right now.
Lee, a very quick question here as we're almost running out of time. So you've talked to us before about what happened in the polls in 2016, and yet people remain remarkably skeptical of polls because they were, quote, wrong in 2016. So what is your short answer when people say to you, why should I trust the polls in 2020 given what happened in 2016? What's your short answer to that?
Short answer is separate out from the polls, which actually weren't bad in 2016, and these prognosticating forecasts where they say there's an 82% chance that Hillary Clinton would be elected, or in this case, Joe Biden's already in the 70s on that. So there's that issue. And then there's the difference between the Electoral College, of course, and the popular vote. 2 of the last 5 presidential elections, 2000 and the last one, of course, someone won the popular vote but didn't win the White House. If you don't believe the polls, tell by what the candidates are doing. Joe Biden's happy to remain not active on the campaign trail. Donald Trump is out there because they know they have to keep a strong enthusiasm and a mobilization behind them.
All right. Lee Miringoff of Marist College, always a pleasure. And thank you all for tuning in this week. Be sure to follow me at Alexis TV News.
And me at Rick J. Newman. And Lee, do you want anyone to follow you?
Follow me. I don't know. As long as you're not a police officer and I'm speeding down the road, you can just follow me at Lee Miringoff is a good place, or at Marist College.
All right, sounds good. Thanks a lot, guys, and we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.